For those of us who work in enterprise and in tech, we're in this weird moment where the AI story is sort of driving decision making, and the decision makers who are looking at that are all focused on the technology.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, Managing Founder of The Space in Between, the behaviour-based UX research partner for enterprise leaders who need an independent perspective to align hearts and minds, and also the home of New Zealand's first and only world-class human-centred research and innovation lab. You can find out more about me and what we do at thespaceinbetween.co.nz. Here on Brave UX, though, it's my job to help you to keep on top of the latest thinking and important issues affecting the field of design. I do that by unpacking the stories, learnings, and expert advice of a diverse range of world-class leaders. My guest today is Greg Petroff, a 25-year veteran of the field of design. And for the past 10 years, Greg has led significant design organizations at some of the world's largest and most recognizable companies. Until recently, he was the Vice President and Chief Design Officer of Cisco Secure, where he was leading the design, innovation, and transformation of one of the world's largest cybersecurity solutions providers. His highlight reel also includes being the Chief Experience Officer at GE Digital, Managing Director of Google Cloud, Vice President and Global Head of Design at ServiceNow, and Senior Vice President of Design at Compass. One of the early members of our emerging field, Greg is a founding board member of the Interaction Design Association, where he also contributed as the Treasurer and as an early conference chair. A generous contributor to the field, Greg has shared his stories and insights on stages across the world, including at TEDx, the Interaction Conference, UX Australia, Enterprise UX, and on the most excellent, in my humble opinion, Finding Our Way podcast. And now he's here with me for this conversation on Brave UX. Greg, a very warm welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm happy to be here.
And I'm happy to have you here, Greg. And Greg, you have a fascinating background in terms of where you've come from, how you made your way into enterprise design. And I wanted to just start with what I understand was your first love in terms of professional love, and that was architecture. And it's coming up, I think it's about 30 years since you last practiced architecture. And you shared with me, you still renew your professional license every year. And that's a lot of years to be paying fees for something that you no longer do. What's the story there?
Yeah, I have 2 degrees in architecture. I practiced as an architect early in my career. I was an adjunct faculty member at UCLA in the early 90s. And I was part of sort of the first generation of architects who used 3D graphics. Now it's commonplace, everybody uses it. But, we were sort of on the vanguard of, information visualization and building visualization and simulation. And in the .com era, I was doing work as an architect, and then I was doing work for other architects. And then all of a sudden, I was in the Los Angeles area. We got discovered by sort of the Hollywood scene as people who could do pre-visualization for film and television and special effects work. And so all of a sudden I found myself doing that kind of work. And then I had a creative company that got purchased by a technology company. And then all of a sudden I wasn't doing architecture anymore. I was in this space into kind of new media, new technology, and, really UX before we even knew what UX was. And so that was the path out. One of the reasons why I maintained my architectural license is I worked so hard to get it. And it's a passion and a love. I still, find great value in being part of that community. I think there's opportunities for sort of things we've learned in the UX community to inform architecture, and certainly the practice of architecture can inform the way we do design work. And so staying close to both of those has been meaningful for me. And, long term, I have this a vision of, what I might do when I'm older and deciding to sort of, not have to work, but it's still working. I have this sort of dream of having a little office with a front door and actually no one comes through the door. I just sit in the room and draw pictures of buildings during the day and maybe have a cocktail in the afternoon and call it a day. So it's always been a part of me and something that I've valued and I've learned from along the way.
That description sounded very much like college.
Yeah, exactly. It would be fantastic to do that. And I actually have this idea I'm calling the Office of Improbable Architecture, which, is something I'm teeing up for like the next chapter of myself at some point.
Well, speaking of things that are improbable and things that are probable, and in this case, things that are possible, you shared with me earlier that your spouse calls you a possibilitarian.
Yes.
But I wasn't really sure of whether or not they felt that was a good, bad, or otherwise type of thing. And I was curious to get your sort of step up on the balcony view here as to what it might be like for them to live with someone who is a possibilitarian.
That is a great question, because I think there are many positives and there are some challenges for the people around you as well, because I'm a problem solver and I'm also a person who can think of endless possibilities to solve or resolve or create, a better solution. And so when someone comes with a challenge, my first instinct is to come with all sorts of solutions like, oh, well, we could do this or we could do that, or it's not as bad as you think. It's a learning opportunity. It's with constraints come opportunities. We can create, something special out of all of these challenges that we have. I've learned over time that sometimes people are coming, that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for you to say, I understand. And so I think for my spouse, she loves the fact that I am able to envision multiple futures for us and multiple opportunities for us as a family and as a community that we're part of. And at the same time, occasionally for her, I drive her nuts. So yeah, that's a great way to frame that question.
That sounds like a pretty healthy relationship. What is the meaning behind possibilitarian? What does it actually mean? How did it come about?
So, I have lots of friends from university who are architects or still architects. And years ago, we were all together in a ski cabin somewhere in the Sierras. And my architecture friends were trying to understand what I do. And they were challenged by, what does a UX person do? And what's the realm of the things that I am working on? And the first name that came up, one of my friends called me an ifnographer. And he goes, I know what you are. You're an ifnographer. And I said, well, what does that mean? He goes, well, you're the guy who studies what if. Another person dropped in, well, isn't that the art of the possible? And then my wife said, yeah, he's a possibilitarian. So that's kind of the landing point of that. That was about, 10, 15 years ago. And it has stuck with me because I think one of my sweet spots is creating space for ideas to percolate and to give them room to grow. And I think that one of the things that designers bring to the table that's really valuable is that we're makers. And so we make to think. A lot of other people think to make. There's nothing wrong with thinking to make, but making to think, the artifact oftentimes will allow you to explore the space that you're interested in faster and more quickly, and the answers come faster. Because the actual craft of making and the medium that you're using, you have a conversation with that. And in that conversation, the answers become clear of what is and what isn't.
It's not that I disagree with making to think as being a really valuable way of creating a product. And I've heard you talk about that before, particularly when you're creating a new product. That's often quite a powerful way to jumpstart the process and actually tease out whether an idea is good, bad, or otherwise. However, I think we've probably both seen, correct me if I'm wrong here, particularly in enterprise software that's been made with perhaps not enough thinking or perhaps not enough design thinking at the outset, and the sort of downstream effects that can have in terms of I suppose you call it UX debt that it can create. How do you navigate those situations with a make to think mentality? Can you use that mentality and that approach to sort of improve the status quo in any meaningful way?
You can. I think the step one that you may want to take ahead of it is really focusing on the outcome. I'm a big fan of Josh Seiden's book, Outcomes Over Output. Josh is a really good friend of mine, and we've known each other for like 20 plus years. We were both like founding members of IXDA together, et cetera. But I find that if you can map the way people are solving problems currently, then you can look for the opportunities for how you can make it better. But if you haven't done that map, then you're just guessing and you don't really know. And you also don't know what is the most valuable set of things or activities that customer values. Customers don't really buy features, they buy outcomes, even if they can't articulate it that way, but they're trying to accomplish something. So if you can focus on what are the most important things that your product needs to deliver and what value it creates for the customer, and then work backwards from that and sort of look at the flow of work, how the workflow gets accomplished. What are their workarounds right now? What are the tools that they're currently using? And then you can start to identify opportunities for improvement. That clarifies that early thinking, and it helps product engineering and design prioritize. And I'll give you an example of this. At Cisco, when I first got to Cisco, we were building a new product, and we had a window in the market to deliver the product to stay relevant, right? So they knew that that product had to be released last summer. And so they had about 9 months of runway, and that's a very short period of time for an enterprise piece of software. And the product team had gone out and done their work and came back with a feature list of somewhere around 480 features that they thought the product needed to be successful. The engineering team, was freaking out. They were like, we don't have the capacity to do 480 features. Product can't tell us the prioritization of these features. So we're just going to start on A and go to, B, C, D, until someone tells us otherwise, that's how we're going to tackle it. And I'm like, well, that's not going to deliver a great MVP or first, V1 of the product. And so we got everybody convened and we said, okay, what are the top 20 workflows that people are trying to accomplish? And let's diagram them in detail. And let's go validate those with customers, how they solve that problem. And then what are the least number of features can we use to deliver on those top 20 use cases or workflows? And then we reduced it down to 10. We said, well, these top 10 actually are a viable product, and we'll demonstrate to our early customers that we mean we're building something of value for them, and that they'll buy even knowing it's not complete, because it's actually significantly valuable for them, even with these 10 kind of workflows done really well. And we reduced the total number of features to about 180. And that was doable within the budget and capacity of the engineering team. And we delivered that. And the early reviews from customers were really strong because of that. So, basically a focus on outcome-based thinking is super, super valuable. And then at that point, you can use the make to think effort to okay, now we know the box that we're in and the thing that we're trying to accomplish, what are the different ways we could solve that problem? There were a bunch of benefits to this work. First of all, it allowed the engineering team to start. And design was they were expecting us to show up with wireframes for everything, and we hadn't even started, right? So we really had to be in an agile model where we were maybe 3 weeks ahead of their pipeline of engineering work. But they could do core things because they understood the structure of the work that was coming their way, and what kinds of back-end engineering they could start with that would support that, what kinds of things that they could put into production early. And then product really enjoyed it because it gave them clarity in talking to early customers, hey, these are the workflows that we're going to deliver, and we believe these are the most valuable, and here's why, and then here's the next 10 that are coming after it. And so I think it's a model for building, a product culture that can work and get people off the feature train, which, can often be, where you put it, a lot of debt shows up from.
How did you work with product and engineering you mentioned prioritization and that there were these 400 features and they weren't prioritized. You nailed it down to 180. How did you work with them to figure out what should be made and in what order?
Yeah, well, again, it came down to the outcomes, right? So we said, okay, this is outcome number one. This is the most important one. What are the set of things we need to do to get there? Well, let's focus on those, the screens and the components. And this is an interesting project too, because we're in the middle of building a new design system at the same time that was sort of going to be just ready for everybody. And so we had an additional restriction on the project, which is we had to limit the grammar that the design team could use to about 35 components. And you can build almost anything with 35 components, but you may not be able to build the most optimum solution with only 35. And so, but we were very rigorous about it. We're like, we're not going to have any bespoke components. We're going to use the ones that are going to be off the shelf and engineering ready, because we have this window of time that we have to get to. Now we can Post-launch, as we go into V2 of the product, we can start to introduce more bespoke conditions, and we can start to fill in some of the spaces that we know could have been better. But we know we could build a really elegant and decent solution with the 35 that we had. And that allowed us also to move very fast. And it kept the design teams focused on the intent and the flow of work over, the shape of the applications. And thankfully, the design system we had was very elegant and simple and easy to use. And so the two things worked really well together.
I've heard you talk about the harsh realities that as a executive design leader that you're faced with. And in fact, this reality that I'm about to mention is faced by the wider team in terms of the practicing designers, the craft-focused designers that work in your orgs. And you touched on that there. And I don't want to suggest that the product that you were working on, the first version, didn't have a great design. But you've previously spoken about times where great design can't be executed because there's a limitation, like in this case, it was the design system that was underway and therefore constricted the amount of components you could work with. I believe you've got, sometimes it's money as well, sometimes it's organizational will. I believe you've got an analogy, a baseball analogy that you often use to kind of illustrate this, I suppose, the compromise, if that's the correct word, that is faced in these situations.
Yeah, I think when you manage a large team in enterprise software, you have to recognize what kind of project you're working on. Not all efforts have equal value to the customer or to the business, right? So there's a thing that it's sort of a Venn diagram. You're looking at like what does the customer need, but also what allows you to sell the product. And when those layer up, those are very important to get right and to be absolutely, amazing. There may be other parts of your portfolio where you're just not resourced as sufficiently to do like the best possible outcome. And you set your team up for failure if everyone's trying to do that, and you don't have that. So, one of the conversations, the analogy I use is, don't go for a home run, hit a single, occasionally we can hit a double, but you actually over time, if you hit a lot of singles, you score a lot of runs. And so, enterprise is a long game, and you can evolve a product over time, mature it, make it better, et cetera. And so it's not about making compromise. It's about taking a longer view of the path to excellence and saying, okay, what are the things that we can do now within the constraints that we have? Where do we add value? And yes, there are some parts that maybe we're not proud of as much as we'd like to be, but we'll get to them soon enough. I think that the challenge with early career designers in organizations is they get very frustrated by that because they want to focus on, everything needs to be like super awesome. And they don't understand that the business has other constraints. They've got to go to market. They've got to be able to sell. They've got to disposition their resources. And the decisions that leadership have to make on a regular basis are hard ones. They don't always make the right decision. Oftentimes they don't. But we have to be in service of those decisions. And, the value that we create should demonstrate itself in the quality of the product outcomes that we build. So, I'm always trying to drive us to drive the best possible experiences. At Cisco, we won 2 Fast Company awards in the time I was there. So it's not like we were not doing awesome work, but there is that recognition of where to place your attention.
And also, I suppose that you can't always be doing awesome work, that sometimes, like you say, you've got to place your attention appropriately for whatever the conditions are. You're right, though, to suggest that designers have this, generally speaking, have this pull towards, disruptive innovation over incremental innovation in the longer term view, those, step after step, let's just edge our way towards a better product experience and we'll get there. And perhaps that's an age thing, perhaps it's a patience or a disposition thing, I'm not really sure. I've heard you speak before about this, I suppose, culture of innovation within enterprise that's needed to enable slightly larger leaps or steps to be taken. And previously, and this is going back maybe a few years now, so maybe around circa 2017, 2018 now, you had included in your toolkit for enabling that things like multidisciplinary strategy teams and customer councils. Do you still feel the same way in terms of like the tools that you would use to build and foster a company's culture of innovation and to change that behavior and get them, I suppose, a little bit more comfortable with taking slightly bigger steps?
I do. I think one of the things, if anything, it's sort of accelerated. I think the tools we have changed radically for everybody. And in those change of tools, the definition of our roles are also could be up for question and probably should be, right? So a mature organization that is authentically reflective and has a growth mindset should be challenging its own norms about who does what. And, many organizations, specifically a lot in enterprise software, product is dictating what gets built, and then design is sort of order takers to that work. And the reality is, with the advent of Figma, we can work so fast that we're often ahead of the product team in terms of what the product should be. And so that dynamic is shifting some of the gravity between those two communities. And the argument I make is that product should be really focused on the buyer and the way work is completed now, but not the way work is completed in the future. Meaning they should understand how customers solve the problem really well and the value of that problem. So, they should be the experts on what the outcomes should be. Then how we deliver the outcomes in the future, really should be left to the design team. The design team can iterate very quickly, can do rapid testing. Now it's very easy for us to build high fidelity mockups and at much lower cost than we could before. We can go in front of customers and get feedback. If you have a really, CI/CD model, you can put things into production and test it and get feedback on it from a set of people in your community. So, you can start to use that as a different way to work. And then even engineering is changing, right? You've got co-pilots that are, like basically helping write code. And you have more teams migrating to a more platform-based approach to building. Versus bespoke software development, mostly because people are getting burned by the sunk costs of the platforms they built. Over time, if you constantly build just enough to satisfy the requirements, the tech debt you acquire becomes, the boat anchor for innovation for the product. And so, if we ideally can move to a more platform-based approach where we're building with the material components of code and design together, we can move more quickly and we can deprecate things and put new things in. It changes the way that we operate and the way they work. So that's one step. I think the culture needs to be ready for it. Incentives have to be aligned around that. And there's some challenges around that. The three disciplines of the three-legged stool have different incentives. Engineering tracks, lines of code built and quality metrics. Career advancement in product is often connected to the size of your remit and the number of features you support. And so it's very difficult for product people to deprecate parts of their portfolio because it might make what they're managing smaller and then they can't get to that next level that they're looking for from a career perspective. Yet we would all benefit by actually turning something off that very few users or customers are using, like learning how to say no and learning how to turn things off. And then design care is really about the outcome. We want it to be awesome, and we may actually not see the business. Is the business structured well? Is it financially viable? We may not care about that, right? And so, if we can find a way for the communities to talk about their why they're there and what they value and just in the human terms, like what's important to them from a career advancement perspective, you can start to align the culture towards things that make more sense. And I'm a big fan of project-based teams versus product-based teams.
Tell me about that, Greg. Why project-based?
So the idea behind that is let's say you establish a new feature and you get it to a certain point and it's successful. The momentum will be to continue iterating on it or adding more capabilities to it moving forward. But that may not be the most valuable next thing or next outcome for the customer. It may be really good and making it better is just slightly better than where it is right now. Whereas if you take that same engineering, design, and product capacity in some other part of the portfolio of needs that the customer has, they'll find more value on it. And so you have to continuously be looking at what are the outcomes that matter, and then the longevity of those outcomes, and then your capacity to execute against those outcomes, and the ability to flex your resources towards the highest priority outcomes and sort of have a above the line, below the line mindset where you say, okay, these are the things that we need to do in the next 6 months. And here, this is our capacity to execute. Let's staff those teams And if we're successful at that, that's great. And only when we've done that can we entertain taking things and pulling it above the line. The one thing I think is a challenge in a lot of organizations is people still try to advance the ideas that don't make it above the line. They're sort of like, hey, I'll be an overachiever and I'll give you A plus B. And what they don't realize is the plus B adds an operational tax to the organization that deprecates your ability to deliver the thing that you're committed to. And so it's really also important for a culture to learn how to say no and to actually enforce that no in the organization. And if you find it part of the organization doing something that's on the no list, having consequences connected to it, like basically just saying, no, we've made a decision from a leadership perspective not to do something. And that kind of clarity, I think, helps teams move faster. And then you have to build an incentive structure that makes people feel comfortable that, hey, you finished this piece of work. Now you're going to be asked to move to something different. Is your career still solid? Are your goals aligned with that? Is it something that I can grow from? So it's a harder tool to manage, but if you can figure out how to do it, you build better product, customers get better outcomes. And I think actually the people at work are happier because they're delivering something that they know is good.
Now, you've talked a lot about product over the last 15 or so minutes, and I understand that most often you've found yourself reporting to a chief product officer, at least in recent years, and that you've worked hard to make that relationship work. I mean, obviously, people want to make the relationship work with their boss, right? But in particular, and in your own words, you've described it as making it airtight. What have you learned about the role of the CPO and the relationship with design as a result of that proximity and that approach you've taken?
I think this is it's a great question. I think, I'm sort of questioning my own ability to say airtightness. And there's a couple of reasons behind it, because the men are from, Mars and women are from Venus conversation, right? The worldviews are so different and the value structures can be so different that you may feel you're aligned, but the semantics, what you use words to describe a problem, and what you think is a yes is a no for the other person, but it's not explicitly said. So I think, one of the things I think is really important is it's not just aligning to strategy, but it's questioning assumptions often. And, how are we doing? Are we working on the right things? What are you worried about? Can, our team help in strategic conversations or strategy decisions? Do you want us to vet something along the way? And these are things that oftentimes are not planned for and you don't have the capacity to do, but you have to find a way to have the capacity to do them so that you can stay close. And I think the leadership role, the chief design role is, managing sideways and up. You talked about Peter Merholtz. Peter has a framework that I like that talks about, depending on where you are in your career, which direction as a design leader are you operating at? And, I do operate down sometimes, but, I count on having a great staff that own those kinds of activities. And, I think the job of the CDO is to have, is to break bread with their product colleagues in the organization and their engineering colleagues in the organization, and to understand the pressures that they're under and the commitments that they're making, and be an advocate for design being in those conversations and not getting the team caught in an unrealistic expectation that you weren't that was made to leadership and you weren't in the room to be able to deflect or augment or question. And therefore your team has to carry a burden of fulfilling something because you weren't there. So it's not an easy thing to do. I've had good relationships with the CPOs I've worked with. I think I've also, I've been challenging for the CPOs I've worked for because I don't always say yes to what they're asking me to do, or that I have questions about why we're doing certain things that they may not have completely framed yet, but they don't want someone to ask that question. But, for me, I think design teams work best when they have clarity. And so, the job of the CDO is to drive as much clarity into their team as possible. And that way people can actually get, great work done.
You talked about staying close, and you also mentioned Peter. And I want to pick up on something that when you were talking with Peter and Jesse, you mentioned on their podcast conversation, which was that you liken the role of the design executive to playing chess. And I'm going to quote you here. It's a little long, but bear with me. You said, one of the things I've learned is that you have to make sure everyone understands each time you move a chess piece on the board, and you can't just do that in a vacuum. I made that mistake where I'm like, I'm responsible for the outcome. They hired me. I don't have to tell them everything we're doing as long as I deliver. So what was the impact of not ensuring that people understood? And I'm assuming you were talking about the CPO relationship, but perhaps more broadly here, that they weren't aware of what the moves that you were making on the chessboard.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you value, right? How you motivate teams is very different in the three different disciplines. The personality traits of individuals who are in product, engineering, and design are different. It's a little bit of a cliche or stereotype, but there's some truth to it. And so what do I mean by that? Product folk are usually very motivated to move up and to get to that CPO role. That is, from a career path projection, control product, and it drives a lot of type A personality behavior and people who are gregarious. They love talking to customers. They love to move fast. They don't like to leave rooms without decisions being made. That kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Engineering teams, they're more black and white and less nuanced about things. They want, is it this or is it that? Are we going to do it this way or that way? Ambiguity, no, that is not good. Let's kind of move forward. Design teams, to be motivated, they need to feel great about the place that they work at. They need to feel connected to some purpose. They need to feel like they are doing something that has societal value, ideally, and you'll get better outcomes from them. They'll be more involved and more invested. When they don't have that, then you don't get their best thinking, and it just becomes kind of a job, and they start to tune out and they get burnt out along the way, and they don't have the ability to do that like extra effort when you need to do that kind of work. And so you need to explain why there are certain kinds of activities that you might do with the design community that you may not have to do with other parts of the organization, that may not be understandable to your cross-functional peers. Like, why are you spending so much time on, team building exercises? Or why is creating, boundaries around sort of work and time of work and meeting schedules, et cetera, matter so much to design? And there's you sort of have to help people recognize that. So part of that is reporting that. Part of that is actually saying why it's in your incentive value as a lead of product to have your design folks do these kinds of activities and what it generates when you do it. And if you don't communicate that, then people will look at that and they'll just not understand why you're spending effort. And they won't equate that kind of work with the quality that comes out. They'll just assume that quality always comes out. And that kind of effort is sort of superfluous or extra. Hey, if you didn't do that, you'd have more capacity or something like that, right? And so I think I found in my career that I focus on, the way I know how to manage great teams is to help people grow their careers, to get them focused on what the outcomes are for the company, to see the vision, to see their role in the vision, to provide some clarity, to give them some autonomy around how they can contribute to it, and then to make them feel safe. And then when you do that, boom, the design team flourishes and really starts to crank out great work. And the people that you have, the quality of your people goes up without actually bringing new people in. They acquire new skills. They feel like they're part of something. It's not that product and engineering don't care. I think engineering cares about that too. Engineering spends a lot of time on training and in their own way. So you can talk to engineering leadership and they'll kind of understand what you're doing. Product doesn't really understand it because product as a profession is relatively new too. And everybody in product, a lot of people in product come from different backgrounds and they all kind of roll their own, even in large organizations. And so they may not value those kinds of activities. So that's kind of one example. I think the other example is when you've found something of value and done something well, you need to promote it so that you get to take that victory lap inside the organization. It should be shared because almost always it's a collaboration between your product and engineering colleagues, but it's not always understood, right? And so, those are just important things around helping your cross-functional peers recognize what it requires to create a high-functioning design organization.
I've heard you talk previously about sharing that victory lap with, product and engineering, where appropriate, where the situation means that there's been that kind of collaboration. I've also heard you tell the story of being in a leadership meeting where you were talking about, I believe, the role of the design org and what the design org had done. And you had a colleague actually say to you to stop in that meeting because you were only talking about design. It seems like there's a precarious balance or line here to be walked between just how much you advocate for the org that you're leading with your peers and how much you try and bring to bear that broader business perspective.
Yeah, it's the retort for that conversation, was sort of like the moment you talk more about design, I'll talk more about business, right? But that's a little passive aggressive. So we're new in the conversation. I think I found it to be less true of recent than it was, in the 5-10 years ago. 5-10 years ago, if you were in that room, it was the first time someone with design was in that room, and you were, fighting for relevancy and also trying to create the space for the work to be done, the right way. I think there's less issues with that now. There's also some other things that go on in enterprise software. So one of the things as designers in enterprise, you have to recognize that the buyer and the user may be very different people. And the product leader, it cares about the user, but they mostly care about the buyer. And so design teams need to think about, is there some part of the experience that helps in the selling of the product? And it's not like doing gratuitous, design work, but is there some part of the experience that demos well? When a salesperson is showcasing a product, and you'll hear that from product leaders, like, hey, our competitor has this really, impressive data visualization. It's blowing everyone's socks off the table. And, and you can go, yeah, we know people are using it and they find it unusable, but the buyers seem to like it because it looks super cool. You have to create space for that. You have to be able to say, okay, there's some part of the product that we have to build that is appealing to the person who's making the purchase decision. And then there's some part of the product that is, connected to the outcomes. Now that is shifting, and this is actually really interesting. And I think a lot of product people don't understand this very well yet, especially in large enterprise. Or let me put it this way. Digital native companies, SaaS native companies understand this deeply. Companies which are trying to become SaaS related companies, that have secure, annual return, recurring revenue. The initial sale isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is, the event that happens when they renew, the renewal event. And what you want to do is you want to be in a situation where they renew without you doing anything. They just love the product so much that they say yes. And that means that users have to be achieving their outcomes, it has to have product market fit. In a way, I've been advocating for this idea around reverse journey mapping and saying, okay, we're at the renewal event. Let's work backwards. What are all the things that went right along the way so that we understand that the customers are getting value? And how do we know? And what that asks you to do is a couple of things. Onboarding has to be a great experience. And then you have to have great instrumentation in your product so you know if a customer is using all of the capabilities. And if they're not, then you should have remediation procedures where you have consultants or staff or the account executive call on that customer and say, how can we help you use this product more? Is this product have the right fit for you? And that also should give you the data to know which of your customers are likely not to renew. And you probably shouldn't even spend time worrying about it because it's just not the right product for them. And, a lot of companies just don't understand that. And I think the more that we can be data driven about that kind of experience, I think that distance between the buyer and the user starts to collapse. But you still have to do some of that work that, attracts eyeballs and attention, especially in crowded market spaces. And, like in security, where I was just coming from, lots of vendors, a lot of really cool UI in that space. And so, great experience is sort of table stakes in that space. And coming up with net new innovation is hard because, everybody's doing really well.
Greg, that thinking sounded dangerously like a CPO. Have you been considering a jump over the fence?
People have told me I would be a good CPO at some point, but I find a lot of design leaders, when they partner with their product partners, end up doing part of their product partner's job for them because they do it to to drive clarity with their teams. Probably shouldn't be that way, but I think we're in that space. I am definitely an advocate for design leaders to become product leaders.
I want to just take a slightly different direction now, and reflecting on your career, right, at the executive level as a design leader. You've worked at some of the world's most recognizable companies, the ones that I mentioned in your introduction, and that's been, I think, for roughly 13 years or so. So that's not an accident, right? Like that's a track record of success. What do you tell people about design when you're interviewing?
I think that when I interviewed for Cisco, that was a really interesting interview process because I was late. They were late, and I had 2 offers already from other companies that were about to expire, and they kind of found me, and I said, "You're too late." And they said, "No, we'll figure this out." And so I did no due diligence on them. I was on vacation when this happened. And they said, we'll set up meetings, which they did amazingly enough. Like in 24 hours, I had meetings with all the people that I should meet with. And so I was very unplugged in those conversations. And what I talked about in that space is good design is a table stakes and a must have. But for it to be successful, there's a recipe, or there's some preconditions for its success. You have to have your ratios of talent have to be in good shape. You have to be able to. You can't have designers working with 4 different product leaders. Product leaders may think everything's great, but the designer's only in meetings and not actually doing anything. And then I kind of talked about, some of the challenges that can happen in organizations that, value short-term thinking over long-term thinking and then advocated for growth mindset, et cetera. And it was really funny because in the conversation, we love that. You should come here, be that person. Talk that way. We need that kind of transformational change here. And I found I really didn't talk that much about design work, except to say that the process of design is how you make products that connect with people. And if you want products to be sticky and meaningful for people that they love, if you want customer love, you do that by delivering something that people feel seen by the people who made the product. And the people who do that really well are the designers. We're not the only people in that space, but that's the special set of things that we bring to the table because we use research and insights and a deep understanding who we're serving, and then we choose intentionally. We make intentional decisions about how people can get work done on their behalf. And if you get it right, then people love you for it, and that's the value that design can bring to the table.
You mentioned the importance, you sound like you've been quite frank when you were talking with Cisco early on there, you kind of unplugged and it just sort of came out. I'm sure there's probably some things you said that you were pretty happy that you said them because seems like it would have framed the relationship to start on a clear foot, right? Like on the right foot. You mentioned capacity though, and I've got a quote here. I just want to quote you about capacity. You said previously, at this point in my career, I probably won't shut up about getting ratios and getting teams to work the right way because it creates the conditions for success. It really does. So this whole ratio thing is obviously something you feel is really important for design to be successful. What would you say, and I think you mentioned, like, for example, you've got designer reporting into 4 different product managers, which is probably one example, but what are maybe other examples of the ways in which we could be working, or people, designers may be working, that aren't the right way of working together, that don't have the right ratios for success to be present?
Yeah, and first of all, I'm cognizant of the fact that not every product or culture or company needs the same ratios, and some of it depends on where the value of the product is created. There are some products where it's deep technical capability that is the value that it creates, and there needs to be a lot of people working on that. And I learned that in Cisco, the security business, there are parts of the portfolio that most of the team is working on algorithms and threat detection, AI, et cetera. And there's product and engineering working together, but design doesn't really need to be there that much because it's really deep under the covers of things. But when on the experience side, when you're talking about delivering experience, I think that the dynamic I look for and the one I try to communicate is the product to design ratio. And it's a physics problem, right? And I was sort of joking about the 4-to-1 thing in a moment earlier, but if you're a designer who's working with, let's just say, 2 product leaders, but the 2 product leaders are working on different things, The product leader feels that they have a designer working for them and may schedule multiple meetings during the week for them to meet and coordinate work, etc. But then the other product leader does the same thing with the same person. And then if you look at the calendar of the designer, all of a sudden, half of their time is in meetings and only half their time is actually doing heads down work. And then if you look at the way their calendars are scheduled, they have maybe hour increments of heads down time interrupted by half-hour meetings along the way. And so you're not using your design resources effectively or efficiently in that environment. The second thing that I think it happens is that when that ratio is off, product leaders will compete for resourcing with each other. And what I mean by that is that, they're trying to push an agenda, a set of ideas forward, and their peers trying to do the same thing. And they move forward in their career by their product being successful. They're going to look at the pool that's supporting them and try to protect or pull or steal and advocate for, work. And that creates friction in the organization. And you have to fend for that. I've heard people say, well, that's just the way things work. And you just kind of manage through it. And I'm like, well, okay, let's consider a different world. Let's say we have 2 designers for each product leader, right? So the ratio is flipped. You have someone who's envisioning a product category, is going after a market, is looking for product market fit, has 2 product designers full-time focused on the work. Those people only meet, when they need to. And the rest of the time, those designers are fully busy designing things which are helping fulfill the vision of that product leader. And that product leader is actually more successful because they're getting more done in the capacity of their work. And, oftentimes when a product leader becomes overwhelmed, in their mind, they're like, I'll just hire a junior PM to make me more successful. And what they really should do is look at their design partners and say, am I adequately staffed on the design side to help execute on some of these ideas? And this goes back to the make to think piece, which is if you don't have enough design execution, then product has to define what it is. And they spend too much time doing that. And then by the time you make it, you discern that the idea wasn't completely fully fledged and there's some incongruity in it that is unresolvable. And so, that ratio is a really important one. And I think the organizations that do that well move way faster. And then, engineering resourcing, obviously you have to have the right, depending on the problem, you have to have the right number of engineers. But to me, I think that is the number one, success factor. And, 1-to-1's okay. 1 product to 2 designer is awesome. I think if you go more than that, it must be something really special on the UI front, or consumer facing, or something that's got a lot of a lot of design work to do to figure out. But the moment you drift in the other direction, the super valuable resource of a designer you have is actually being wasted, and you're actually you're not using the company's resources effectively. So to me, I always try to describe it as a physics conversation. Like, how many hours in the week are they actually in Figma, and doing what you want them to be doing? And when you see the ratios are wrong, you recognize that they're not there that often.
And you've got some thinking around design ops that's coming to mind here, and I'll paraphrase you here, and that's really that design ops should be primarily about resource allocation and providing visibility into what's actually available. And so, understanding how full people's calendars are so that you can actually have a conversation that's grounded in reason rather than just people getting stressed out and wishing that things were different. How much of that is actually about the design org wrapping their heads around spreadsheets and just getting really comfortable with that analytical side of what makes the design boat go faster?
Well, you have to have the right people. I mean, the average designer probably doesn't want to do that work, but someone who loves design and has kind of product management skills loves that work. At Cisco, right before I left, we just finished putting the entire organization in Airtable, and we use that as a tool. You can use other tools, but we use that as a tool, and we could tell you the capacity of every designer, what they're working on, what they're currently working on, and what they're planned to be working on. And we roll reports up on a regular basis to product and engineering peers. And the reason behind that was we would get, there's always situational asks from leadership, like, hey, we need you to do this thing. And I'm like, awesome. That's fantastic. What would you like us to not do? Right. Because, you can't ask people to do more than they have the ability to do. You can at times if you're willing to kind of flex, but you can't do it consistently. And so, but if you don't have that information, you have no way to say no with a straight face. You don't have the way to share that point of view with your team. I did this thing last summer where I bet the GM for the security business a case of beer that we wouldn't adequately staff all of the work that they wanted to do for the year. And he was like, no, we need to. And I'm like, I know, but culturally, we just have this problem of being able to do it. And we should have above the line and below the line. It shouldn't be like about trade-offs. We should just look at our capacity and say, these are the things we're ready to do. And we're adequately, and I even built a little flow chart that said, is this an idea that's important? Yes. Is it staffed appropriately? Yes, go, and then is this idea important? Is it validated? No, do more validation. It was sort of like this sort of path to sort of help people kind of evaluate it. My peers didn't really take to that because, of course, that meant they had to rationalize some of the decisions that they wanted to make that sometimes aren't, the path that everybody wants to take in the path they want to go. But it was a useful meme in the organization, and he used it like publicly. Like we had an all hands. He goes, "Mr. Petroff here has bet me a case of beer, that we can't figure this out, and I like beer, so I want to get my case of beer, right?" And so that actually helped us have conversations in the organization that were healthy. Like, are we staffed appropriately? And one of the things we did do is we figured out a way. We had to do a little bit of staff augmentation and reshifting and rebalancing of resources, but we found a way to make sure that we were adequately staffed for the work that was planned for the fiscal year.
Listening to some of these stories, in particular that one that you shared, it seems that there's a bunch of peculiar decisions that are made around or informed by the incentives that these cross-functional organizations working to. It sounds pretty dysfunctional at times. You seem to be someone who tries to reach across the aisle, so to speak, or tries to build bridges between silos, tries to shake people out of their narrow focus and to actually see the broader outcomes that everyone should be striving for. I don't know, how do you maintain a positive attitude from role to role, for example, or from, project to project or feature to feature when it seems like it can be quite tricky at times?
That is a really great question. And it's probably one where occasionally it gets me in trouble, right? Well, first of all organizations are made up of humans. And humans, we're all incented differently. We're all built differently. And we all have something going on. And what I mean by that is if you really dug into to the person, you'd recognize that some of the ways they make decisions are based on either past trauma or some part of their childhood or something, right? And so the notion of organizational dysfunctionality and functionality is there's always going to be that, even in the best run organization, because human beings are there and we come with faults, and that's what makes us, the people that we are. I choose to see the glass half full, and I choose to see people as being intrinsically motivated to do the right thing. Occasionally you run into people who don't, but most organizations, if they're reasonably healthy, will ferret those people out. So I don't know. I guess I've come to the point of you have to act on it. It just comes with the territory. It is part of, and you take wins along the way and you show how you can make culture better. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. Like, we had a pretty young team at Cisco, and their relationship with their cross-functional peers were usually one or two levels of hierarchy different. So you'd have like a manager working with a VP, or that would be three levels, because there'd be a senior manager, senior director, VP, level, and feeling the hierarchy, and then therefore acquiescing in the conversation versus holding their own in the room and saying, no, this is my role, and these are the things I think are important, and doing the right work. And there's a way of holding your own that respects hierarchy in an organization, but also allows you to communicate more clearly why something's important, so that a stakeholder can understand it and then go, oh, I understand you. And, oh, that's a good idea. Well, let's move forward with that. And you kind of get at that win. And that's really around developing narrative storytelling skills in the organization. So, one of the things we did very quickly is we built this program we called Campfire, and it was all about storytelling. And we had every designer tell a story about what they were currently working on. So that was step one. Like, what's the story of your work and why is it valuable for Cisco? And, not everybody could describe that. So they're like, okay, so there's some work we need to do there around connecting what you do to the outcomes that matter, so that you feel like you have some, not only ability to see the value that you're creating, but also in that autonomy, maybe work better, towards those outcomes. And then we also discerned, like, some people were great at telling that story and were really well respected in the organization, and other people were challenged with storytelling. And it wasn't that they weren't respected, they were just not able to make as much impact with their cross-functional peers. So, that was an effort around helping us build narratives around our work. And we drove that, and it became really successful and very popular in the organization. And we invited product and engineering peers to that community because it was about how we can use story to align everybody towards the right sets of outcomes. And there are some tools that you can use as a designer to say, okay, who's it for? Why do they care? What outcome is it going to allow them to get to? How are we going to monetize that? I may not understand that part, but I can ask someone to tell me, like, how are we going to make money doing that? And then that can draw a theme and a line around for everybody to rally around. So
the designer themselves can actually start to understand what matters from the perspective of that VP, for example. If you're a manager and you're dealing with a VP, you can frame things in appropriate terms.
Yeah, and you can bring your case to the table in a way where, they may not say yes, but they understand what you bring to the table and they value it, right? There's a difference between you bring an idea to the table and they're indifferent, or they bring a table and they deeply understand the contribution and they thank you for it, but then they explicitly say, yes, we are going to do this, or no, because, and then that's useful too, right? To hear the context that the product leader might have that the designer didn't have, and that can help them become more knowledgeable about how the work that they do connects to the business as a whole.
Yeah. You spoke earlier on about the glass half full metaphor and how you take that posture, and that's one of the things that helps you to, I suppose, keep flying the flag and keep fighting the good fight, so to speak. And it made me think about, it's almost like you're saying, there are those, this is a cliche, I suppose now, but there are those things that are up to you, which are what you bring and how you can position things and frame things and try and encourage people to think in certain ways. But there are also things that are not up to you, which is the decisions that they make and what they choose to do with what you've brought to them. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was back in April 2022, and I think this sort of dovetails in nicely here, but you be the judge, is you started a talk by quoting Paul Hawkins for Rethinking UX, and that's India's largest UX community. And what Paul said, and I'll quote Paul here, quote you quoting Paul, so that's kind of meta, was, when asked if I'm pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science about what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, you don't understand data. But if you meet the people who are working to restore the Earth and the lives of the poor, and you aren't optimistic, you haven't got a pulse. And you then went on to liken what he was talking about there to the will that you see in the design community to make a meaningful difference, even if it's just in the day-to-day work. It doesn't have to be some grand thing, but just to make a meaningful difference. That was about a year ago that you said that. So what I'm wondering is, from where you sit now, today, how pessimistic or optimistic are you about the future of design?
That's a great question. I definitely think that our community is under some stress right now. There's been a lot of downsizing in organizations. There's a lot of great talent out there looking for work, but I think that's temporary. I think the problems that we have as a society globally are asking for a designer's lens to solve. And I think we're also in this moment of transition between a framework for how the world worked that no longer works and what the new framework will be that we're not sure what it is. And you can see that in politics. You can see that in geopolitics. You can see that in a couple of the wars that are going on in the world that are just terrible. And you can see it in the climate crisis. You can see it in a lot of different things. In the background, there's just crazy science going on right now that is going to solve all kinds of things around energy and food production and healthcare. And as much as people in our society may feel disenfranchised, your actual quality of living in general is higher than it's ever been. And so part of the narrative that we as a world culture is, and now I'm speaking about the US, because I think the US is lost its future narrative, right? It used to be a very future-focused culture, like, hey, tomorrow's always going to be better. And, here's a set of things that we can do to get there. I think that's still possible. And the reason, that connects to my possibilitarian, glass half full perspective. But I do think that there's a path where we need to be working with NGOs, with governments, with other venues that we may not have in the past to help them be more effective and more efficient, and give them a leg up so that the solutions that they bring to the table are preferable to alternatives that may not be in the best interest of us long term. And I think there are more and more people who are thinking that way. I just feel like we're in a moment that we need to get through. So I think the pessimism is a little higher, but my optimism is still there.
I was curious, I suppose, behind the scenes there to understand just where you're personally sitting. You mentioned some of the challenges that are out there in the community, and obviously those challenges have arrived at your doorstep as well, right? Like this is a pretty interesting labor market to be in for everyone up and down the hierarchy. How have your recent experiences in the labor market changed your perspective on work?
You and I talked about this. I'm very privileged. I mean, I've worked for a long time. I have, I'm financially stable, so I don't have some of the same particular issues that, some of my peers or other people earlier in their career might have if they lost a job or are in transition. I recently left Cisco, and I'm, looking for the next thing for me. And I'm also looking at potentially doing different things, not leading the big design org, maybe doing something in an NGO space or somewhere else. I don't need the same kind of income, in the future. I do want to work. I like working, and financially I do need to work. I just don't need to work at the pace and scale. If the right big job comes, I'd be interested in it because I enjoy doing that. So I think that's one thing. I think for those of us who work in enterprise and in tech, we're in this weird moment where the AI story is sort of driving decision making, and the decision makers who are looking at that are all focused on the technology. 5 years ago, when they might have been, hey, we have to have our design game needs to be where we invest so that we can, it's a table stake activity now. We have to be, as good as or better than our competitors. Their focus right now isn't that. And that's okay. And we should be okay with that too, and recognize it. And then there's a huge opportunity for us as a community to help shape that so that, the kinds of experiences that come from that work are equitable and smart and don't alienate, people, and are positioned in a way where they will be disruptive because the technology is disruptive, but they are potentially co-creative as well in terms of opening other opportunities for new kinds of roles to emerge for people from an employment perspective. So it's an interesting moment, and I think we should be looking at what we need to do differently as a community for sure.
Most definitely. Paul Hawkins, who we spoke about a little earlier.
Yeah.
I understand you're a fan of his book on intelligence.
Yeah.
What was it in that book in particular about the way in which we make decisions that you learned?
So I'm a big Paul Hawkins fan. For those who don't know, he was one of the founders of Palm back in the day, before the first little handheld device that we used to have, in the late 90s, early 2000s. But he took his fortune and sort of, used it to invest in brain research, and he got very fascinated by it. And he has this term, he calls it a prediction framework. He has a notion around intelligence, and which kind of makes sense to me. IQ is, in his world, is sort of the addressable memory that you have and the ability to use that memory to infer what happens next. It's amazingly similar to generative AI conceptually in terms of how we respond to a problem is based on our collective experience, and we're making a educated guess as to what to do next based on the collective things we've experienced and seen in our lives. And that prediction framework is really useful because it allows us to survive in the wild, and it allows us to be successful at work. But it's only useful when the rules around you are stable with what you know. And when the rules change and you don't see it, then the framework that you have no longer is, useful for sort of attacking that space that you're entering into. And so, we've got to constantly be scanning to retrain ourselves along the way. And this is one of the reasons why like CEOs have kind of lifespans, right? They get to a very certain senior point in an organization and they're almost isolated from the customer and the universe. And they have a whole group of people around them that respond to them. And all the decisions are based on, the framework that they bring to the table, and which is, for many of them created on very smart understanding of the world. But then if they stay in the role for too long and the world changes and they don't see it, the playbook that they bring to the table no longer works. And then the company falters because it misses a step. And that's when you need someone whose prediction framework has been reframed because they've been paying attention to changes that are going on. We're definitely in one of those moments for sure. I've seen a couple of them in my career. The rise of the internet. I'm old enough to be there early at the beginning of, I had the first website of any architect in the US, I believe, ages and ages and ages ago. It was nothing to be proud of, but, it was like super, super early. And then watch that kind of go through a cycle. The mobile phone, the iPhone and the smartphone revolution changed, dramatically a whole set of things. And we're now in this AI thing moment, which, is going to reframe lots of things. And, there's some overstepping going on too. I think some people are like, if you read the pundits, they're like all these sort of dramatic predictions about how people are going to operate and work. And I'm not 100% sure because, human behavior has to also meld with these things. And by the way, that's an opportunity for design because we can help shape how we connect to and partner with, a digital partner, someone who's there with you along the way. How do you operate that in a way that's meaningful for people? We're in an interesting moment.
And thinking about, you've been at these top roles for at least the last decade or so.
Yeah.
And thinking about what you were saying there about CEOs and just the gravity of the situation that we're currently in probably won't be evident, I don't feel, for another 5 years or 10 years, just sort of how big this is or otherwise.
Yeah.
How are you thinking or talking to yourself, or what sorts of things are you doing to ensure that your way of making decisions, your reference, if you like, for how the world's working is staying contemporary?
That is a great question. I spent the last year kind of deeply in the AI space, kind of working on Cisco Security strategy around it and our design response to it. If you followed my career, I've been talking about intent-based experiences for quite a long time. And so I'm sort of excited about the moment right now because to do intent-based experiences, you need to have back-end systems that are sort of ductile and can connect things. And to do AI well, you need to have back-end systems that are ductile and can connect things. And so, some of the work that organizations may not have paid attention to in the past, they sort of have to do now to be able to have accuracy in the models that they build and how they present information. So that's, interesting. And then the next piece of it, I'm going to do some writing about this in the coming months. The prompt is a really interesting way to operate with the system. But not all of us know what question to ask. And so can we have systems that anticipate what we should be doing or give us a nudge or an offer along the way. And what would be the next best thing for us to do or for you to do based on the knowledge of you and where you are and what your role is and what job you have and what's going on in the context of your work. We have this opportunity to reimagine the kinds of experiences that we create that could be much more experiential.
That's a refreshing and glass half full perspective. Greg, this has been an energizing and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for so generously sharing your stories and insights with me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Brendan. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Greg. And if people want to connect with you, Greg, they want to follow along, they want to understand what you're up to and what you're contributing to the field, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think, I'm most active in LinkedIn. So I have a LinkedIn profile and, shoot me a connection request and I'd be happy to say hello.
Sounds good. Thank you, Greg. And to everyone who's tuned in, it's been great having you here with us as well. Everything that we've covered will be in the show notes. It'll be in detailed chapters, so you can hop around, in particular on YouTube, to the parts of the conversation that you want to hear again. You will also be able to find a link to where to find Greg on LinkedIn and any other links that are relevant. If you've enjoyed the show and you want to hear more great stories or great conversations like this with world-class leaders in UX research, product management, and design, don't forget to leave a review. Those are really helpful. Subscribe so the podcast turns up every 2 weeks, and pass the show along to perhaps just one other person that might get value from these conversations at depth. If you want to reach out to me, you can also find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Brendan Jarvis. There's also a link to my profile at the bottom of the show notes, or head on over to my website, which is thespaceinbetween.co.nz. That's thespaceinbetween.co.nz. And until next time, keep being brave.